back up. Good morning, everyone. I'm the new program VP, and this is my first panel discussion that I've put together for our branch, and I'm really excited about the topic. But before we get to the panel discussion, I just wanted to reiterate AAUW California's 2020 public policy priorities, which are achieving economic security for all women, supporting a strong system of high quality public education, and guaranteeing equality, individual rights, and social justice for a diverse and inclusive society. But in order to achieve those goals, it is important to understand the inequity that currently exists. So that leads me to our incredible panelists that we have today. We'll be discussing the City of Long Beach's Racial Equity and Reconciliation Initiative. And the champion of that framework for reconciliation is Long Beach Councilmember Rex Richardson. Councilmember Richardson represents the 9th District in North Long Beach and has a history rooted in advocacy for our most vulnerable communities. His record of accomplishment includes championing the Long Beach Economic Inclusion Implementation Plan, establishing the city's Office of Equity, expanding shelter capacity to address homelessness, creating the PATH Youth Adult Diversion Plan, leading the Long Beach My Brother's Keeper initiative, and securing major investments into the revitalization of North Long Beach and the Michelle Obama Neighborhood Library, the new Houghton Park Community Center, and hundreds of millions of dollars in private commercial and industrial investment. Councilmember Richardson, his wife Nina, and 2 young daughters are residents of the Collins neighborhood in North Long Beach. Our next panelist is Dr. Juan Benitez. Dr. Benitez is a member of the Long Beach Unified School District Board representing District 3. Dr. Benitez earned his bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD from UCLA. He serves as the executive director for the Center of Community Engagement and as an associate professor of history at California State University, Long Beach, Go Beach. With over 20 years of experience in higher education, Juan heads university-wide community engagement projects, programs, activities, and initiatives. Through his work with the CCE, Dr. Benitez helped to implement the California Endowment's Building Healthy Communities initiative in Long Beach, which is a 10-year effort to improve neighborhood conditions that contribute to good health. Dr. Benitez also worked with AmeriCorps and community groups to create a collaborative vision to address youth development, parent engagement, equity, and opportunity gaps and school discipline issues in Long Beach schools. And rounding out this incredible panel is Katie Balderas, the City of Long Beach Equity Officer. Katie has led the Office of Equity for the City of Long Beach Department of Health and Human Services launch in 2017. The office coordinates the city's language access policy, Human Relations Commission, Government Alliance on Race and Equity Activities, and works on a variety of policy issues, including immigration, cannabis equity, and economic inclusion. Prior to launching the Office of Equity, Katie worked on a variety of public health issues, including asthma, tobacco control, prenatal services, and housing as a social determinant of health. She is an alumni of Cal State Long Beach, where she received her bachelor's degree in psychology and her master's degree in public health. So thank you all so much for being here. Like I said, this is an exceptional panel, and we're really excited to start this conversation. So participants, while we have an opportunity for Q&A after this discussion, please feel free to type in any questions that you may have for our panelists, and I'll be checking that as well. So I think we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with Councilman Richardson. You know, you brought forth the city of you brought forth to the City Council the framework for reconciliation. Can you explain what it is and why it's needed?
Sure. Thanks, Linda, for the invitation. Honored to join you. I know many of the folks here within this group. And we worked together before around some things at the Obama Library in North Long Beach. So I'm certainly honored to be here with you and joining you with this esteemed panel. So to talk about the framework for reconciliation, really you have to go back to sort of how this conversation of equity and racial equity came to the forefront in Long Beach. I represent the 9th Council District. It isn't traditionally known as a very powerful seat. You don't see a lot of commissioners coming from the 9th Council District. You don't see assembly members and senators coming from the 9th Council District. We're a district that's historically known for not receiving a lot of investment. But when you think about, there's a lot of human capital in North Long Beach. It's a fifth of the city's population lives in North Long Beach. A fifth of the city's students go to school in North Long Beach. And we start to think about people as an asset, then North Long Beach becomes much more valuable, much more influential. And so the way that we've sort of told the story about North Long Beach and how we can make the investments necessary to bring everyone's common human dignity up to a common standard was by talking about the concept of equity. If you provide areas and communities and neighborhoods and people with what they need to thrive, and you talk about it from that standpoint, then the things that are good for North Long Beach are the things that are good for East Long Beach, are the things that are good for West Long Beach and Central Long Beach. And so the language of opportunity and the language of equity is really, was really an opportunity to tie our neighborhoods together so that we can rise, you heard the term, the rising tide lifts all ships. And so we began this conversation of equity years ago. Some of it started with some of the work we'd already been engaged in around violence prevention and other things. And that turned into our My Brother's Keeper initiative, which was really a citywide focus on boys and young men of color from cradle to career. A strategy that integrated Long Beach Unified, Long Beach State, Long Beach City College, and the city. It's very similar to our college promise, but it was really focused, focused on boys and young men of color and ensuring that they have outcomes that are favorable, that ultimately are better for the system and ultimately better for their lives, and by framing them as assets. From there, the next natural step keeper, there were a number of initiatives that sort of came out of that, like young adult diversion, the PATH program. A lot of these things stem directly from that. And so we developed all these plans, all these strategies. We need a vehicle to move it. That's one of the conversations about establishing the Office of Racial Equity started in the city of Long Beach. And that conversation started around 2015. And myself, a number of council members, the health department, we had conversations about what would it look like if we were to take all these things that we had done around My Brother's Keeper, Government Alliance for Racial Equity, and really change the structure of our city to give it a home and start building capacities to deal with race and inequities within our city. We know we're a very diverse city. You've heard of it as the second most diverse city in the nation. But you've also heard the term the tale of two cities, two different realities in our city. And the purpose of this office was to begin building our capacity to understand equity and to be able to identify it and institutionalize it so that we can start to change that narrative of the tale of two cities to really create one Long Beach experience for everyone. And so around 2015, we took those steps to establish the Office of Equity. Now, over time, and I'm sure Katie's going to talk a little bit more about what they do, so I'm not going to jump too much into that, but a lot of capacity has been built from engaging in National League of Cities, REAL initiative, this Race, Equity, and Leadership initiative, Government Alliance for Racial Equity. We've built a lot of capacity. So this year, with the unfortunate tragedy of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis, what you saw was sort of nationally, this issue of anti-Blackness and institutional racism came to the forefront. And when that happened, it landed right here on our doorsteps in Long Beach. Protests outside of City Hall, all down Broadway, Pine Avenue, down in the Pike, it turned violent. There were protesters, but there were also looters and people who were not there to protest and people who were there to cause damage. It was a scary moment. And I remember how emotional the city council was that night. I remember how emotional our leadership within the city was that night, because no one wants to look on TV and see the things that we've invested in be burned. But also we understand the moment that we're in where we need to be serious about racial equity. It isn't something that we place on, that we add in. It's something we should be baking into our values. It's something that we should all take very incredibly seriously. We in Long Beach have to do better. And so that night, That night, myself and a number of colleagues, we said, you know what, tomorrow morning, we're going to get up and we're going to clean up the city. We sent out a number of tweets, sent out a message that, hey, it's time to clean up the city and get to work. The very next day, 2,000 people responded, showed up in North, Central, West Long Beach, downtown, and they cleaned up every piece of broken glass. They painted out every piece of graffiti, every inch of graffiti in one day. By 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, the city had been cleaned. And then we got to work and figuring out how we start to deal with and reconcile with these issues. And so the very next council meeting, I put forward a motion. And the city council showed a lot of respect for this motion. It was unanimously supported. And the idea was to establish a process for us to begin to reconcile and deal with these issues and put a chart, a path forward that makes sense. And in the heat of the moment, we were in the middle of a pandemic where we couldn't have public comment. Our council meetings weren't even happening at the time. We were all just dealing with the pandemic. We needed to create an opportunity for people to vent and for people to tell us on the record what, how they feel about these situations and how does Long Beach's, the way we talk about race, how does it reconcile with our policies? And so we began that process, and it wasn't easy, but the idea here was you've got to imagine an airfield where, planes are circling, waiting on the air traffic controller to tell you to land that plane. But guess what? There's no runway laid out to land the plane. So planes are going to continue circling. That's the issues of race and equity in our city. They continue to circle and circle. We do plan, we do study. There's no runway laid out to land this plane. The framework for reconciliation laid out the runway to be able to talk seriously about issues like Citizen Police Complaint Commission, a commission that's been in place for decades, and over time has sort of lost its public integrity and credibility for its ability to, for the public to engage and provide some level of oversight on police complaints. That's an example of a plane that had no runway to land. Issues like the economic difference between North and Central and West Long Beach and East Long Beach, how we know small businesses, they don't survive the first 3 years in some of these areas, but we treat them the same way as they would in areas where businesses would thrive. And how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile just a whole host of disparities within our city? 2 zip codes, 17-year difference in life expectancy. How do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile Central Long Beach and North Long Beach that struggle for decades to build a community center while our city builds a $100 million pool? How do you reconcile those things? And so these are the conversations that the framework will allow us a runway to begin to process. Now, out of that process, there were 4 steps. First was an acknowledgement. Acknowledge that institutional racism exists and that the only way to really address it is to call it out, acknowledge it, and put forward alternative models that are more inclusive. And so we did that. We passed a resolution calling institutional racism a public health crisis. Since then, we saw the County of Riverside follow suit, the County of San Bernardino follow suit with us. The entire Southern California Association of Governments followed suit. They all passed the same resolution as Long Beach. So it's percolated across the region. The second step was to begin listening, a formal listening process on the record. Obviously, we couldn't have big land use element style town halls with tents in a pandemic. So we used town hall style Zoom format and focus group Zoom format. And we heard from hundreds and hundreds of people, some with very good feedback on the things that Long Beach could do to truly make one experience for everyone. And then the next process was convene, bring people together to talk about what we heard from the listening process and how does that reconcile with what the data says about our city. How is our police department doing? How are we doing in our economic development department and digital divide? How are we doing on these things? And then the final step was really catalyze, put forward an action plan that codifies these things and allows staff to begin the process of reviewing what's actually feasible. And so 107 recommendations came out to the city council. Some of them included to go to the ballot in November with a proposition called Measure US, which is a 15-cent tax on oil production that takes place in our city to invest that into youth, climate, and health equity, things that we know came out of this reconciliation process. That's one of the recommendations that came out. Another was to begin the process of reforming our Citizen Police Complaint Commission to create a modern police oversight commission. Another suggestion was to create a center to focus on health equity within the city, focus on diversity within our police and fire departments, a whole host of recommendations. And so between the budget, which was adopted last Tuesday, Of the 107 recommendations, about 45 of them were funded. And so the city should be proud to know that not only did we pass a plan, we funded about 45 of those recommendations to begin now. It's one of the things I'm most excited about within those recommendations is the city of Long Beach is establishing an Office of Youth Development and an Office of Violence Prevention. We have a youth strategic plan, a violence prevention plan, a My Brother's Keeper plan, but there are no staff to implement these plans. There's no funding deployed to the community to implement those plans. So these offices will take ownership for building our capacity to really develop a first-class, world-class system to develop our youth within the city. That's inclusive of schools, job centers, recreation centers, a real inclusive strategy. And this November, on November 3rd, should yes on Measure US pass, which is polling at about 70% within the city, that would add an additional 1.6 to 1.8 million to go out to the community. That's not coming to the city. That goes out to the community to help help nonprofits like this one do more outreach as it relates to youth, as it relates to health equity, and as it relates to climate equity. So altogether, between the investments in the budget and potentially what will come from Measure US is a $5 million structural commitment to equity within our city to help begin to change that narrative of Tell Two Cities and creating business environments, health environments in our youth so that they can thrive. So I'll pause there. That's a very high level overview of sort of where we've come and where we're heading. And I'll reserve the rest for my panelists to sort of chime in on their perspectives.
That was so informative. Thank you so much, Councilman. You really did provide a lot of information about the framework. It's very exciting news. Dr. Benitez, can you share with us some of the inequities within the school district and what you as a board member are doing to address them?
Thank you, Herlinda. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I want to share and express some kudos to Councilmember Richardson for his leadership in advancing our reconciliation efforts, because what's happened is, as he alluded to, it's a model, not just for other cities and municipalities, but also for institutions like our own school district, our city college as well. So thank you to the city and in particular, Councilmember Richardson. So just a little background for folks. Because sometimes when we talk about Long Beach Unified School District, it's in reference to our own neighborhood or our own neighborhood schools, right? So this concept of a tale of two cities really does also apply to our school district. And just to be mindful, our school district includes Lakewood, Signal Hill, and Catalina Island, right? So we're not just talking about Long Beach Unified School District. And that means that we represent more than 70,000 students, right, at 85 schools. We are the city of Long Beach's largest employer with over 10,000 employees in our school district. So in some ways, we operate much like a city does, right, with a close to $1 billion budget in our school district. So really, education here is an example of where the rubber hits the road, right? Our public education system is the only thing that's compulsory in our country. That means everyone has to participate in our public education, right? So many of the values, ethics, principles, ideals that we aspire to be as a nation are institutionalized, so to speak, within our public education system. So 87% of our students in our district are students of color. 2/3 of our students are on free or reduced lunch, meaning they are in poverty. Their households, their families are in poverty to be able to qualify for free and reduced lunch. 10,000 of our students have been identified as students with disabilities. Again, that's a large percentage of our students that are on individual education plans that require targeted, specific, strategic support. Most of those students are students of color. So as we know, with our educational institutions, we also have a historical legacy of segregation, of marginalization, of institutional racism. And this is reflected currently through disparate educational outcomes. So whether we're talking about A through G requirements, right, to meet the minimum criteria to be able to be eligible to apply to a CSU or to a UC in our state, whether we're talking about college and career readiness, So when we talk about 21st century job skills, 21st century personal development, global citizenship, right? Any of these 21st century concepts, they're attached to disparate career and college readiness right now for our students of color, particularly our Black students. About 12% of our school district is made up of African-American students. Whether we talk about college going rates, right? So we can be ready and prepared. That doesn't necessarily mean that we still have access to our higher educational institutions. And ironically, although we've made great growth with our college and career readiness, we have more African-American students, for example, taking and passing AP tests. We have more African-American students, Latinx students, meeting minimum A through G requirements. Ironically though, we don't have the same kind of growth with college going rates. So something's happening, right? And it is a reflection of a lot of the work that still needs to be done. Added to this, as the council member also expressed, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. We are in the midst of an economic crisis. We are in the midst of social unrest. So as a reflection of that, school districts like our own have made the strategic decision to go 100% remote. So what does that mean for the families that I've just described, right? Where 2/3 of our students are poor, where 87% of our students are students of color, where 10,000 of our students have been identified with at least one disability. What does that mean for this population, our most vulnerable population, our highest needs population, when our educational system has had to, for health and safety reasons, pivot to a 100% virtual remote environment? So this creates a whole new set of challenges, not unique to a school system, but because we're talking about education here, and we're talking about issues of inclusion and equity, it magnifies and adds new challenges to the pre-existing inequities that historically were already leading to disparate educational outcomes for our students. So when we talk about things like trauma, when we talk about things like social and emotional well-being, when we talk about challenges with digital inclusion and accessibility, when we talk about language access, right? All of these things get magnified because now we are completely dependent on our technology infrastructure, which was already structurally at a deficit, right? Even prior to going into a 100% virtual environment. So those are things that our district had to very quickly pivot and address around, right? Not all of our households have internet access. And even with internet access, not all of our students had access to a Chromebook, right? Or to a laptop, right? And even with access to that, not all of our families could easily navigate through our technology bureaucracy, right? It's one thing to be able to log into something. It's a completely different ballgame to be able to make the best use of the technology. Again, when it comes to how we were delivering instruction, how we were delivering support programs, how we are delivering services, and how we are delivering specialized education to our most needy, most vulnerable students. So what we decided to do in conversation with our city leaders is to align our district efforts around the reconciliation framework and the reconciliation efforts. So we're in the process of developing our own school districts, inclusion, equity resolution, all right? Building on the building blocks that the reconciliation framework has already established. And it's not a perfect framework, but that's the beauty of it. It's an approach, right, to dealing with racism, to dealing with anti-Blackness, right, to dealing with structural inequities. And so the courage that our city leaders showed in putting that framework out there really provided an example for us, but an opportunity for us to build on it, right, to really clearly listen to the learnings through the city's own listening sessions. So again, our equity resolution will also include acknowledgement that our educational system institutionally has led to structural inequalities in our society. Secondly, that we can also be a convener right? And take this listening to the next phase, which is being a catalyst for action. So one of the things that we've already done in partnership with Long Beach City College, in partnership with the city, and in partnership with California State University, Long Beach, is to take a look at the national model of what we call the Long Beach Promise, right? Which provides specific support, specific access, specific systems alignment to our local students here. In a nutshell, what the Long Beach Promise intent was to address our equity, our opportunity gaps, and our achievement gaps. So again, the context that we're in has really forced our institutions, particularly our educational institutions, to look again and in some ways assess and re-examine this envisioned future for students in Long Beach, and really look at data to see, have we been doing right by our African-American students in particular, but by our students of color in more general terms, and then what do we need to do? And so I think just as it was important for the city to acknowledge, whether that was through the Citizens Complaint Commission or through other formal spaces, our school systems have decided that it's an opportunity for us to do the same, to really look at what we've been doing. And look, quite frankly, there's a lot of opportunity for growth, but to also use what we've been doing well as a building block, particularly because, again, for our highest needs, most vulnerable students and families, we have a whole new set of educational challenges, barriers that are not mutually exclusive of other structural, societal, regional challenges and needs that we're facing, whether that's housing, whether that's mental health, right? So again, this presents an opportunity for the only thing that's compulsory in our country, that's public education. Participation is compulsory. So why not use us, our district, as an anchor for that very important work? So I think together with our city, with Long Beach City College, with CSULB, we are reimagining what a promise for all, a 2020 promise for all looks like from a systems perspective, and in my case, from a higher education and K through 12 context. So I'm proud to be on this call today and share sort of where we're at as a district. And again, if folks want to know a little bit more, we're passing out hotspots, we're passing out Chromebooks, we've set up new platforms for engaging our students in the midst, again, of this crisis that we're in, but being very mindful that this crisis has disproportionate effects on precisely the populations that we're trying to uplift. So what I like to always share with folks, council members probably heard me say this 50 times in the last few weeks, equity requires policies and resources. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum, all right? So policies and resources, when we talk about systems change, are happening right now in real time. And that's the impetus, again, for me encouraging as many folks as I can with the platform that I have the privilege to have, to civically engage, right? This is the time to hold our systems and institutions accountable so that when we talk about equity, it's upheld through policies and resources.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Benitez. And there are pages and pages of faces, so you may not have seen her, but we're very fortunate to have participating in this as a participant is Judy Seal, and Judy was one of the architects of the Long Beach College Promise, and she continues to work towards access and equity, and she's amazing. So I wanted to acknowledge that she is viewing all of this and was nodding her head when you were speaking. So so you're doing a great job.
I see Judy's big smile this morning. It's one of my favorite things to see.
Yeah. So let's see. Now we're going to go to Katie Balderas. And Katie, I think you have some slides that you want to share, but your background is in health, and now you're leading the Office of Equity. Can you explain the nexus and how one looks at race through a health equity lens?
Yes, absolutely. Are you able to see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me get it to the first one then. Wonderful. Good morning. That was a really tough act to follow behind two elected officials. Again, my name is Katie Balderas. I'm the Equity Officer for the City of Long Beach. And I work currently in the Department of Health and Human Services, although because of the fantastic work that's been championed by Councilmember Richardson and the subsequent way that racial equity has been elevated in the city, with the start of the new fiscal year, I'll be moving to the city manager's office because the city has really prioritized this work. So I just want to start with an allegory that we share a lot in public health. So imagine that you and a friend are standing on the side of a river, maybe you're camping, and suddenly you see a child coming down the river struggling for their life. So you jump in, you pull them out and rescue them. But then before long, another one comes down. And this keeps happening all afternoon. So eventually you're exhausted from pulling kids out of the river. And so you think we have to figure out how these kids are falling in the water. We have to go upstream. And so as you go further upstream, you notice that there are bridges, and some of the bridges look like the one on the left that are strong and stable. You can tell it's been cared for and well maintained, whereas other bridges are like the one on the right. It's definitely shaky and broken with flimsy boards. And so it's not a surprise that the kids who are falling in the river are falling in because they're trying to cross this really shaky one. And so of course, all of our bridges need protection and reinforcement, but it's easy to see which ones need the most urgent attention and resources. And so our role as public health professionals means that we address health disparities and inequities by identifying and repairing those bridges that are not cared for, that have lacked investment and maintenance. And we consider the social and the physical environments where we live are bridges to opportunity. And so some of our communities, some of our neighborhoods are like the strong bridges. They have access to healthy food options like farmers markets and grocery stores. They have cleaner air, more parks that are safe and clean. They have more access to preventive health care. And so in Long Beach, we see that in other parts of our city, that the physical, social, and economic environments are bridges that have lacked investment and have lacked attention. And so we see more air pollution. We see families really struggling and paying more than half of their income in rent, risking displacement as rent prices go up. We see that their food options are limited to liquor stores, fast food, or convenience stores. And we see that our young people in those areas have fewer opportunities for quality education, good paying jobs, and leadership and youth development. And so this is, I think, what Councilmember Richardson was really referring to as our tale of two zip codes. And so I wanted to show an image of how this shows up in Long Beach. So when we look at our city, or when we talk about our city, oftentimes our diversity is the thing that we celebrate the most. But the fact is that the city of Long Beach remains heavily segregated, both by race and by income. And so you'll see the map on the left shows our racial demographics. You can see that the red, where it's concentrated in the color red, that is where the majority of households are white. So you see that's primarily on the east side. Whereas the rest of the map, which encompasses downtown, central, west, and North Long Beach, is more purple, showing where we have more households of color, more Latinos, Black residents, and Asian residents as well. And then you can see that the map on the right shows where the highest number of low-income families is living. And so that's the increased red, kind of purplish red color. And so you can see it when you overlay those two maps, that the highest communities of color are also the ones where we see communities living, or residents living, in the highest rates of low income or poverty. And these are the neighborhoods that also lack good resources like well-paying jobs, strong schools, education, healthy foods, and all of the other factors that we know communities need to thrive. And so, I wanted to do a little research, and what I learned about the American Association of University Women is that you have a strong focus on education of young women and girls. And so I think it's really important that we highlight and understand where our young women and our girls are growing up. They're our future generation. And so this map here shows, the red color shows where the majority of children under the age of 10 are living in Long Beach. And so if you saw those first two maps where it shows concentrated communities of color, concentrated poverty, you're also seeing that that's where our future generation is growing up right now. And so we have to ask ourselves as a community, do our children in West and Central Long Beach and North Long Beach have the same chances to be healthy and to thrive as a child who's born in East Long Beach? And so in public health, we use data. So let's look specifically at some life expectancy numbers. We broke it down by neighborhood. So the data that I'll share right now is by census tract, and you can see that the number that just popped up is the life expectancy of a baby born in this neighborhood in East Long Beach. They can expect to live 86.3 years. Whereas a baby born in this neighborhood near downtown, kind of south central Long Beach, would expect to live 68.9 years. And so when we do that math, we can see that there's a difference across town of life expectancy of 17 and a half years, which is really high. So, you know, in public health, our role is to really dig into the root causes. We want to understand why health inequities exist. And we know that the city is taking these disparities really seriously and working to make investments in neighborhoods. But again, you know, we always want to focus on the why. And so for many years, we focused on chronic diseases, communicable diseases, with things that focus largely on improving individual behaviors, things like eating right and exercising, getting a flu shot. But we know that the environments where we live really shape our health a whole lot more than our behaviors, than healthcare services and genetics alone. And so we have to understand how our neighborhoods got here by looking back at our history. And so we know that, you know, we often celebrate now Long Beach as a really diverse and welcoming place, but it hasn't always been that way. And so these are our redlining maps of Long Beach from the 1930s. Excuse me. So as we were coming out of the Great Depression, the New Deal offered a pathway to home ownership for millions of Americans, which helped them launch solidly into the middle class. But the government determined who was worthy of receiving government-backed mortgages by using color-coded maps to mark where people of color lived, shading these areas in red and deeming them too risky for mortgages. And so this gave rise to the term redlining, which was a practice that happened in all major US cities, including Long Beach. And this map shows this slide shows our maps. And so you can see the slide on the photo on the left is the map of West Central Long Beach, with much of it red, deeming it one of the risky neighborhoods, meaning again, people in these neighborhoods could not access mortgages to buy, to maintain, or modernize their buildings, many of which fell into disrepair. So this subsequently lowered property values and reduced the opportunity for families to build generational wealth through homeownership. Now, on that same map, the one on the left, you can also see that the blip of blue and green at the top, which meant a neighborhood was deemed safe or worthy of investment, is where Bixby Knolls and California Heights are, which remain affluent areas to this day. And the middle map shows North Long Beach, which is mostly yellow, the color indicating that it was also a riskier area given the demographics living there. And then the map on the right shows Belmont Shore shaded in blue, meaning it was mostly white households and thus worthy of investment. And the impact of redlining, although it was, 80, 90 years ago, we know that it still plays a role today in the ability for everyone in Long Beach to have economic and housing stability and economic mobility. And this graph shows how rates of homeownership continue to vary by race. And so at about 25%, the homeownership rate for Black households is less than half the homeownership rate of white households. And we know when we look at a different data set that the homeownership rate in our Cambodian community is even lower at 23%. And so redlining is just one example of many policies, both big and small, that have created disparate outcomes across our city. And so, we often ask ourselves, where does that leave us now? These are policies that were put in place long before many of us were even born. And so while we are not directly to blame for the creation of these policies, we are responsible for addressing them as we move forward. And so while we talk a lot about equality in America, or the importance of treating everybody the same, we also still see that many groups of people are left behind. And so this is a great side-by-side comparison of what that means. As you can see, the concept of equality at the top has different people of different shapes and abilities trying to ride the same bike, which is great in theory, but really only works when someone starts from the same place or has the same needs. Whereas equity is making sure everyone has an opportunity to attain their highest level of health and success in life, regardless of things like their race, their gender, their income, ability, sexual orientation, or gender identity, and many other factors. And I strongly stand that equity is not just for the benefit of marginalized people or underserved communities. It helps improve outcomes for all of us, even white folks. And so when we're aware of how racism has shaped the course of our history, how it affects our systems and institutions, we can work to design a city that works better for all of us. And so the Office of Equity was designed to do just that. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but we focus in 3 areas. We want to focus on engaging community voices, especially those most marginalized, to help shape policy and systems. Focus on making inequities visible using data and storytelling, like the maps I shared, and then really building our city's capacity to advance equity. And so this is one of the tools that we've created to help walk city staff and leaders through processes that help us think differently, think about how we center the voices who have been most impacted by racism into the decisions that we need to make moving forward. And then as Councilmember Richardson provided an overview of, we helped lead the implementation of the reconciliation framework. And ultimately, through the listening process, the convening process, we ended up with a report, a very ambitious report with 4 overarching goals, which you see here on the slide. And underneath each of these goals, there are 21 strategies and a total of 107 potential actions that we know will help us land the plane to really push racial equity forward. And so, the first goal is really getting our own house in order, ending systemic racism in Long Beach, in all local government and partner agencies, including Long Beach Unified, through internal transformation, because we know it starts with us. The second is designing and investing in community safety and violence prevention. And from a public health perspective, when we talk about violence prevention, we're talking upstream. We're talking about investments in early childhood education and things like housing and in youth development from the earliest ages. And then we also know we have to redesign police approaches to community safety, because it's, we see the disproportionate impact of police violence on Black folks in particular, especially Black men, and we know that has to change. And improving the health and wellness in the city by eliminating social and economic disparities in the communities most impacted by racism. So we've got a lot of work to do, but ultimately, we know that this may be uncomfortable work, talking about racism, reconciliation, how white supremacy affects all of our systems, including education and local government. And it can be really hard to wrap our heads around the idea of, as Juan said, the resources and policies needed to make it happen, because we know it requires growing power in areas where power has been denied or excluded. And so, but at the end of the day, we believe that explicitly and intentionally addressing the legacy of racism will benefit everybody as a result. And so our economy will be stronger, our health outcomes will be better, because we'll be able to prevent disease rather than treating it. And our schools will be pathways to careers and college and other opportunities. So, when we know that when our communities, all of our neighborhoods are strong, that there'll be bridges of opportunity, and we won't have to jump in the river to continue to save people who fall through the gaps. So that is it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And if you're interested in any of the links that I shared, I'm happy to paste those in the chat too.
Again, incredible presentation, Katie. There's so much information here, and I'm glad that we have 20 minutes to really ask questions, to have comments and have a discussion, because we really do have 3 experts in their fields here with us, and so we should really seize this opportunity. So I'm going to, well, actually, before I do, I wanted to remind everybody that we have like a short survey that we're going to send out right now during the Q&A portion, and we'd really like you to fill it out and send it back. And we'll start with the Q&A now, and we'll process all of that. So one question that I have already from Carolyn Eggleston is that she's read the initiative document, and that it seems very comprehensive, the Measure Us, comprehensive and complete, but it also seems like a lot. How will all of you develop the first priorities? And I'll open that up to anybody.
I'll jump in. Katie, feel free to follow up if I miss anything. So what's good about the report is it was presented in a way where it says these things are immediate, these things are short-term, medium-term, long-term. So you have all the immediate priorities are kind of called out. Secondly, the health department went through and identified what budget requests that they had that they'd like to implement in the first year. And so within that, there was $3.2 million within the budget dedicated to implementing strategies called out within this plan. Of the 3.2 million, 2.5 million was structural, and 1.5 million was directly in alignment with the health department. So some of those resources are, for example, Katie mentioned that the Office of Equity is moving from the health department into the city manager's office. That they will be the vehicle to provide oversight and to help drive a lot of the implementation of these recommendations. There's a new deputy city manager position. We typically have one. Right now we have 2 deputy city managers. And that is Teresa Chandler. And Teresa Chandler is going to be assigned to work directly with the Office of Equity. So you have a whole capacity of team that's coming together to help implement those things. Within the 1.5 million within the health department, a lot of the recommendations, so the Office of Equity, you think about it, that they're going to handle a lot of the things in kind of the part where Katie talked about getting our own house in order. They're looking at a lot of that stuff. But a lot of the other things from like the police reform stuff, the CPCC study was in the budget. So the process can begin in this new fiscal year. All the work around youth development, the upstream stuff that Katie's talking about, housing, equity, economic inclusion, all of those things were funded to begin that work in this fiscal year. So there is a strategy, and I did my count. I'd love to see Katie's count, but I counted about 45 of those action items out of the 107 reflected in our first year plan, which I think is pretty significant to get 40% of your work outlined and ready to go within the first year. Katie, I don't know if you've done the same analysis. This was my back of the napkin analysis on how many we got funded in the budget. What do you think?
We have not done the analysis of how many got funded in the budget, but we did put together a spreadsheet to count how many things we said we would do immediately, and it was a little more than we realized. It was quite a lot. That this work requires urgency, and we're it's ambitious, but it has to be done. So when we counted everything that council added to what we needed to include in the report, I think it was about 52 immediate items, something along those lines, more or less.
And
but,
I think
it's pretty significant.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Councilmember Richardson said is totally on point. We have to get this work started. We have to invest in it. The city has done a lot of equity-centered plans, whether it's around youth violence prevention, My Brother's Keeper, early childhood, but it has long lacked the investment in it. The health department historically has only received about 1% to 2% of the city's general fund, while we know that a large portion goes to public safety, which is defined more traditionally as police and fire, but we also know that health and public health and upstream violence prevention efforts also promote health and safety. So we're really trying to make sure we're part of that public safety continuum, and it comes through the investment.
And I would say, I'm sorry, go ahead, Herlinda.
Oh, no, please, Juan.
I would say in many of the ways that Katie and Rex just described, our school system priorities, and that includes, again, our 3 systems, but in particular district, are informed by the city's priorities, but also help to shape the city's priorities. One of the things that I always get reminded of when I see the data that Katie shared is, if you were to overlay those indicators with our educational success indicators, we're talking about the same geographies. So it's a critical reminder that where a child grows up, where a student goes to school, should not determine their educational success, yet it does, because those are exactly the points of intersection for equity to occur. So when we talk about things like our schools to prison pipeline, when we talk about the criminalization, particularly of Black and brown young men and boys in our neighborhoods, those schools are exactly in that Central Long Beach, right? West Long Beach, North Long Beach heat maps that Katie showed. So again, our systems, educational systems, are informed by the city's priorities, but also help to shape the city's priorities. And those are the points of intersection.
And just to add on the intersection points, so a lot of the things called out within our plan are intersectional with school district and college district. One of the things that came out of this this reconciliation process was to take another look at our college promise. And that's intersectional across 4 institutions to make sure that it's not only taking kids who are already on the track to college, but making sure that we're looking at kids who may not be on the right track and make sure that the college promise is a promise for all. There's references to the North Long Beach Higher Education Center, which has been a priority of the City of Long Beach and Long Beach City College for a few years now to bring community college presence into the Jordan High School surrounding neighborhoods. So these are the types of things that address educational attainment levels, address our readiness for the workforce. All of these things are intersectional between these different districts, but sometimes it may be a city document where it starts, but it'll permeate through all the planning documents from the different agencies. So that's sort of how it works and how it's intersectional.
And this is kind of a follow-up question, Councilmember, and Katie, you touched on it a little bit, that about 45 initiatives were passed.
Apparently it's 52 now.
52. Okay, so 52. We're passed in, but how will they be funded? And then Dr. Benitez, there are a lot of programs that and policies that resources that you talked about. Implementing those, how will they be funded?
So within our budget,
I can answer mine in 30 seconds.
Yeah, in our budget, like I said, we dedicated 3.2 million in the budget. 2.5 of it was structural. Structural means it happens every year. That's ongoing revenue to drive this work. And then should Measure US pass, that's 1.6 to 1.8 million directly going into the community to support advancement of these equity strategies in alignment with the reconciliation plan every year. So that, and again, this measure, it's looking great. It's polling at about 2/3. It's not a tax on local residents. And it creates funds to implement plans that have been sitting on a shelf. These are great award-winning plans to really invest in our youth, invest in our climate. Things that are important to everyone, particularly given what's going on with the climate today, what we've seen just this past week. And we don't have any funds dedicated to implement any of these strategies. They're all in direct alignment with racial equity. They're in direct alignment with understanding the barriers that people have. You think about that bridge image, right? All of those things are bridges we have to come across. Every one of us has been a youth. Like, young people are going to grow up, right? Health, that's one of those bridges. Health disparity is one of those bridges. Climate's one of those bridges. Urban hood island effect and all of those things, they're all bridges we have to come across. We have to reinforce those bridges to give everyone a fair opportunity to thrive in our city.
And Herlinda, we're currently in the district in our public engagement process around the budget. So right now is the time to email us, submit public comments, leave us messages. We have a school board meeting next week on the 16th. It is a public hearing specifically on what's called the Learning Continuity Plan, which directs where about $95 million this school year, this academic year, should be prioritized, right? And the framework is that it should be prioritized around our highest needs, most vulnerable students, English learners, our low-income students. The framework is that, but the priorities, right? Do we want to do tutoring? Do we want to provide more social and emotional support? That's where the public input. We have a budget hotline right now in our district. I'll post it in the chat. So if you have thoughts around how that 95 million should be budgeted, right now is the time. We have to approve that by the end of this month.
Wow. That's great. Katie, I make sure that, if we could maybe get the slides of your presentation so we can share with the branch, we would love to do that. So I wanted to ask you before we moved on. And then, having this very unique perspective of being a school teacher, Shelley Arnold, she asked what the city of Long Beach is doing to make universal internet access free throughout the city.
Yeah, and in response to that question, I dropped a link to the city's digital inclusion efforts in the chat. My colleague Rebecca Kauma, as part of our economic and digital inclusion, much of the work that Councilmember Richardson initiated with the Everyone In plan is really focused on closing the digital divide. And we know that part of that is expanding accessible, free or low-cost internet access And so she's in the process of bringing together all different kinds of stakeholders. Many are from, you know, Spectrum and Charter and all of those companies to help co-develop the city's digital inclusion roadmap right now. And so I dropped the link in there and you can get more information. And then the other question I saw that I wanted to just address really quick is how we engage the East Side in these efforts. And full disclosure, I live in the East Side. I live in Park Estates in the 3rd District. I was lucky enough to buy a condo here when prices were good. And a few years into living here, I was looking at our homeowners association website, and we still have racially restrictive covenants publicly on our website that specifically say that no people other than Caucasian people can live in this neighborhood. No African Americans, no Asian folks, no Mexican folks, and you know, they're using dated language. These documents were developed decades ago, but this history is real. And I feel like many folks in Long Beach, a lot of my peers, other white folks, are not necessarily aware of this history. They think that segregation and racism happen in the South or in other areas, but Long Beach is so progressive, we're so diverse, like this isn't a Long Beach issue, but it absolutely is a Long Beach issue. So I think it starts with making sure people are aware of this history, the racist history of Long Beach. And so we shared a racial equity timeline on the reconciliation website. I can drop a link to that in the chat. And then I think we also have to recognize that we are part of a collective, we're part of a community. And, you know, I think one of the wonderful American values is of individualism, but in many ways it can harm us when we only look out for ourselves and our families and not the child in the neighborhood across the city. Because I know as my child grows, he's going to be affected by what happens to the other children in the city. And so I think we have to recognize that our fates are tied together. And I think that's another way to get everybody engaged. And I don't think the work of advancing racial equity is solely the responsibility of people of color. And I think white people have to be in this fight too. So that's why I'm here.
You're so right, Katie. That's, you know, a perfect way to end this, right? And so I want to thank our panelists, Councilman Rex Richardson, Dr. Juan Benitez, and our equity officer, Katie Balderas. Feel free to unmute yourselves to give them a round of applause because I think it's worth it. They were amazing. Thank you so much. So I think we're sending out our poll. We want you to you know, click it real quick and submit it because your feedback is so important and helps us get more panels in here. So I look forward to hearing the results. This is going to conclude our meeting for today, but we welcome feedback. Right, so feel free to give us send us an email, make comments, share your thoughts and your ideas. And, you know, I want to acknowledge one more time that AAUW Long Beach has been around for 100 years. And we are really in great tradition, but not so much that we're not willing to learn and to evolve. And I want to thank again this group of exceptional women welcoming me and encouraging me to take a leadership role so quickly. And for not just saying you want to be more inclusive and diverse, but actually being open to new ideas and suggestions. And I'm really proud to be part of this organization, and I encourage others to look into joining. If you're interested. So, thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.